Hello, animators! Today I want to address one of the sticky points of animation that a lot of people get hung up on because it's a bit of a mind warp. Also, it involves math. So today's topic is the relationship between frame rates and the speed of your animation. The big takeaway from this video is that if you want your animation to go slower, you have to add more drawings. Think about this scenario. You've made some animation and you play it back and, ooh, whoa, that was like a little faster than I thought it was going to be. That's not exactly the way I imagined it. What do I do now? So the temptation is to take this into a video editing software and to slow it down, right? To do some sort of time stretch. Or in your animation program, maybe you change the frame rate, like you had it on 12, but let's try 8 frames per second, or maybe 6 frames per second. This sort of approach is not a good idea. And really, you should never resort to doing this because it compromises your control of the animation. So let's talk about why. First, a reminder of what a frame is. The term frame goes back to the days when we were actually working with physical film, right? 35 millimeter, 16 millimeter, 8 millimeter, Super 8, all those things from days gone by. And you actually had individual little rectangles that had a picture in it and it was on a long film strip, right? You've probably seen these. Maybe you've even touched one at one point. So now in the digital era, we still talk about frames, even though we don't have that strip. And each frame is one individual picture that the digital projection or the computer is playing, showing us at a specific rate. So this frame rate is a constant number of frames whizzing by per second. So you might have 24 frames per second, right? FPS, frames per second. Or maybe you have 30 frames per second. Or maybe you have this weird number 29.97. What other frame rates can you think of? 25. This is the European standard, PAL. 60 frames per second. You see this in gaming or in sort of like high frame rate films. Maybe you have 15 frames per second for web videos, stuff like that. Whatever this number is, it is a constant. One video has one frame rate. You can't say the first 10 seconds of the video are 12 frames per second and then the next 5 seconds are 30 frames per second and then we're going to move to 15 frames per second. You can't render out a video that has different frame rates embedded in it. If you look at any video and you look at the information, you're going to see that it has one frame rate. And that could be any of these numbers, really. Or it could be a totally random number, although that would be weird, but that's what we can do in the digital age. So rule number 1 is that you need to pick a frame rate and stick to it on a project. And that's going to be your overall frame rate. Most likely the frame rate is going to be picked for you. If you're working in cinema, it's going to be 24 frames per second. If you're working in TV animation, it's going to be 30, or it's going to be this weird 29.97, which we just round up to 30 when we're animating because we can't do 0.97 of a drawing. If you're working in Europe, you're probably working at 25. So let's go back to this pseudoscience of persistence of vision. This idea that the brain blends sequences of still images into the illusion of movement. Our brain is doing this by seeing two very similar images in rapid succession, and it's just making an assumption of what comes in between. So our brain likes to make sense of what it is seeing, and so if we miss this little bit of information, i.e. what is coming in between these two drawings, the brain's just going to assume, oh, I must have blinked or I just missed something, but obviously that thing must have just moved from here to there. So this illusion of movement can be broken by different things. One is if the difference between the two images is just too great for the brain to see the connection, to make that assumption. And in these instances, we get a strobing effect because our brain can't connect them. The other thing that can break the illusion is if the image holds for too long. So the human eye can perceive still images at approximately 1/6 to 1/8 of a second. And when an image is held that long, it looks like a still image followed by another still image. When we move past that threshold, so around like 1/16 of a second or 1/24 of a second or 1/12 of a second, then that persistence of vision, or technically it's called beta movement effect, kicks in and we start seeing the illusion of movement. So what, as animators, can we get away with? We need to backpedal, and here's where the math comes in. Okay, so if you recall, rule number 1, frame rate is constant. So if you pre-decide your frame rate for a project, that's determining how long each single drawing or each frame is going to last. So if you have a project that is running at 24 frames per second, then each frame is being held for 1/24 of a second, right? That makes sense. 12 frames per second is 1/12, right? 1/12 of a second. 8 frames per second. All right, this math is okay. We can handle this math, right? Okay, so let's take this to the next level. What if you animate something at 12 frames per second, but you need to convert it to 24 frames per second? Now the computer can do this for you, but what exactly is the computer doing? Well, it's taking each frame that you make at that 12 frame per second composition, and when it converts it to 24 frames per second, it is just duplicating it and making it into 2 frames. And so actually you are having 2 24ths, which obviously is the same as 1/12. All right, you're still with me here with the math, right? So it's important to understand what the computer is doing, because what happens if you have a 12 frame per second composition that needs to be converted to 30 frames per second? So the computer is going to start taking this one frame and it's going to be like, all right, I have to, oh, wait, this doesn't divide evenly. Now what do I do? Well, now we're getting into this sort of thing, right? 1 equals x over 30, and then you go like this, 30 over 12. So what we have is this computer is going to take this one frame, and when it's converting, it is going to say 2.5? No, you can't do a half of a frame. So what it's going to do is it's going to take the next frame in the sequence, and then it's going to add those 2 halves together, and now you've got 3 frames, and then it's going to do the next frame. And oh, what do we do without that half? Same thing, add those halves together, etc., etc. So the problem is when you start having one drawing that's held for 2 frames, and then the next drawing is held for 3, and the next one's held for 2, and the next one's held for 3, well, your animation starts to lose some of that fluidity, and you are no longer in control. So we don't want the computer to be controlling us. So now that you understand how the computer is actually converting your frames when you change a frame rate, let's look at a few other mathy scenarios here. So let's say you have something that you animated at 12 frames per second, right? But it's looking too fast, and you're like, oh, well, what if I just play this at 8 frames per second? Okay, well, 8 frames per second. So this conversion is going in the opposite way. So what the computer is doing is it's saying, well, I have 1 frame here, and I'm holding it for 1/12 of a second. Well, instead of doing that, I'm going to take that single frame and I'm going to hold on it for 1/8 of a second instead. Well, what if you convert that to 6 frames per second? That 1 frame is then being held for 1/6 of a second, right? And if you are really going for it, it's being held for 1/4 of a second. And this is that funny area where our eye starts to perceive it as a single image rather than being able to connect that gap into motion. So you may ask, well, I mean, what if I just have these videos at like 6 frames per second or 4 frames per second in a 24 frame per second composition? Won't that solve the problem, right? It's playing at 24 frames per second. Well, no, because if you remember, what this actually means in a 24 frame composition is 2/24, right? And then when we get to 8 frames per second, if we convert that to 24 frames per second, we're looking at 3/24. So each individual frame is actually being held for 3 frames in this 24 frame per second world. And once we get here, and so at this point here, now we're having this one drawing being held for 6 frames. And so let me tell you, that's not really animation anymore. That's holding on still images, because that's what our eye is going to perceive. So as a side note, in animation terms, when your drawings are being held for a certain number of frames, we have a term for that, and that is animating on 2s, animating on 3s, animating on 4s, oh, don't do that, on 6s, yikes. And of course, if you are making a drawing for every single frame that is being shown, that is called animating on 1s. So in this world of perception where we are manipulating how our brains perceive movement, we can sort of dance around above this threshold here. Sometimes you can get away with animating on 3s. Most often you can get away with animating on 2s. And there's some occasions where animating on 1s is appropriate. Let's dig into this a little bit more. Okay, so here's where we're going to start to do a little bit of mental gymnastics. So you have a project and the frame rate for that project is 24 frames per second, right? Somebody's told you that, right? Like me, your teacher, or your studio that you're working for. So you now have a choice. You can animate on 1s. And that means that you're going to do 24 drawings for every second, which means that each drawing is going to last for 1/24 of a second, right? But if you can get away with it, you want to reduce your work in half, right? So maybe you decide that you want to animate on 2s, and that means that you are going to do 12 drawings for every second, and that means that every drawing is going to last for 2/24 of a second, which actually is 1/12 of a second. And so a little cheat that you can do is if you know that you are going to always animate on 2s for an entire sequence, and you're never going to need to go to 1s, is you can, for that particular sequence, set your frame rate to 12 frames per second. Right? And then when you drop it into this 24 frame per second overarching project, the computer is then going to convert it back to 2/24 of a second, right? It's going to hold those 2 frames. So this is sort of a little bit of a, functional cheat that you can do. The only thing is, if you set up a composition, set up your animation project to be 12 frames per second, then you do not have the choice to go animate on 1s within that. So if for some reason you felt like your animation wasn't quite working out at 12 frames per second and you needed to add a few in-betweens here and there, you've sort of limited yourself, and you really can't do that. So if as an animator you want the most flexibility to add in-betweens if you need it, to manipulate certain frames very individually, then the way that you want to set up your composition is that you want your base frame rate to be 24 frames per second. And most animation interfaces will allow you to set how long you want your frames to last. So you can set the new frames you add to last for 1 frame, or for 2 frames, or even 3 frames, or 4 frames if you're really going to go there. So for example, here in Photoshop, if I'm going to have a little ball that follows this motion path here and it goes around this tiny little loop-de-loop, I could animate on 2s, and we'll get the spacing kind of like that. And so I'm adding 2 frames. A little bit of motion blur there. But then if I'm looking at my spacing here as I go around this tight little loop, if I add another 2 frames, well, the ball is going to be like probably like right over here in the next couple frames there. And then it's going to be, if like I'm keeping this sort of speed intact, it's going to be up here. And what you'll see is that when I play that, the frames are just not going to really connect along an arc. And we're going to get this sort of little bit of strobing effect. So let's see what that looks like. All right, yeah, can you see that? That weird little jump that's happening right here in the center? That is not good, because it doesn't look like the ball is going around the arc, because in order to keep the speed constant, we just don't have enough resolution in the timeline. So this is an instance where when we are going around this little curve, we really want to switch to 1s in order to define the arc. So what does that look like? That means that right here, we're going to add an in-between. Got to turn on our onion skinning, and we're going to make sure right there. And then we'll add another in-between right here. Do we need one here? Probably not, because we have a much smoother arc. And maybe we just add a little bit of motion blur on there. A little bit of motion blur on here to help define the arc. All right, let's see if that made a difference. There we go. So now you can really see the difference, right? Now that ball is going around that arc. And so this is why you want to maintain that flexibility of being able to move from 1s to 2s. Maybe sometimes 3s is appropriate. So these are all rules that, of course, you're welcome to break. But if you want to get that really kind of beautiful fluidity in your animation, if that's something you're after, then you need to know how these frame rates relate to the number of drawings you are making. The last thing that I want to address is, what do you do if your animation is just happening too fast? So again, there is that temptation to be like, oh, just time stretch it, right? But now you understand what the computer is doing when you are time stretching that footage. And if you are already working on 2s, then you are ending up dancing along that threshold of what our perception can actually see. And especially if you are time stretching by some random kind of like weird number, then you don't know how many frames you're going to end up with. So if your animation is just happening too fast in certain spots or overall, what that means is you need to go and add more drawings. You need to in-between. That is what really can make the difference between animation that's sort of just like hops along and maybe it looks okay, or animation that just has a lot more flexibility and fluidity. When you go in and add more drawings, again, it's similar to adding resolution to your timeline, right? So if you have a photograph that is 1280 by 720 and you try to zoom in, well, you start to see the pixels really soon. But if you start with a photograph that's 1920 by 1080 and you zoom in, then you have a lot more resolution. So it's a similar sort of thing where you have more frames that you can work with and you can get more of that nuance out of your performance with animation. Okay, so I hope that this lengthy explanation clarified a few things that people often have trouble grappling with when it comes to figuring out, the number of frames you should have and how to set your timeline frame rate and what frame rate to work at. If you have questions, please post them down in the comments and I will try to clarify further.